The following regards a zombie apocalypse show and may have some gore shown. Viewer discretion is advised. Okay, so I just spent way too much time going through the 11 frickin' seasons of The Walking Dead, and I wanted to make a video about it. I actually have 2, maybe 3 videos planned for The Walking Dead, and you're watching number 1, so here we go. Throughout its long run, The Walking Dead has sported its fair share of characters. So many, in fact, that towards the end, it gets so oversaturated that I just turn my brain off. But amidst all these characters, there are a few handfuls that stand out among the fanbase. The obvious being Rick, Carol, Daryl, Carl, Michonne, and probably the biggest one, Glenn. Who doesn't love good old Glenn? But among all these main characters, The Walking Dead is not really known for its great villains. My least favorite character in the show is a villain, believe it or not. And a lot of the time they end up being the same a-holes copy-pasted over and over. But there is an exception. One gleaming light in this messy villain status The Walking Dead has, and that is Negan Smith.
Hot diggity dog! This place is magnificent!
Often regarded as one of the best villains of television, Negan manages to be both the comic relief and a terrifying badass throughout his time on the show. And today I'm going to be explaining why Negan is the best character in The Walking Dead. But before all this stuff, spoilers for The Walking Dead. I'm not saying go watch all 11 seasons, but I don't know, just a warning. Now before we get to Negan, we need some context around his appearance and why it's done so well in this show. The Walking Dead follows Rick Grimes and his friend's journey through a zombie apocalypse and their interactions with different groups. During season 6 of the show, Rick and his buddies were held up in a place called Alexandria. They run into a decent chunk of people, usually killing them all in the end. At one point, Rick and his buddies decide that they need to take out this satellite base filled with a bunch of people, and they do just that. They kill a whole ton of them, but they end up making enemies of a group known as the Saviors. They tussle with these people for a bit, fighting a little, but never meeting their ultimate leader, until eventually, the group is herded into a tight circle surrounded by Saviors, and we finally meet the barbed wire bat wielding, leather jacket wearing, leader of the Saviors, Negan. His first line of dialogue sets the tone perfectly.
Pissing our pants yet?
Setting up Negan's humor, but still leaving a dark undertone. Negan introduces himself to us and says that he'll have to kill one of them as punishment for killing his people. This obviously is a gut punch of his statement, but think about what he's actually saying here. Rick and his guys killed probably around 200 or so people in their sleep for basically no reason other than them being a potential threat. And Negan's retaliation is to kill one of them. It's a 200 or so to 1 ratio. Rick is getting the better deal here. All this to say, obviously it's terrible to lose someone we love, but math would state that Negan is being really generous here. During this whole scene, the mood is incredibly grim, with barely any background music, sound effects, or editing. It's just Negan's voice and the wildlife around them. But while it's an incredibly tense scene, Negan is cracking jokes throughout the whole thing, and it's really funny, honestly. But his calmness and humor just adds more terror to the character, as if he's able to be this cheerful in a situation like this, who knows what he's like when you actually piss him off. One reason that I'll get to later as to why I love Negan so much is that he's hilarious but a huge threat, and he displays that to full effect here by cracking jokes yet literally holding the lives of these people in his hands. Then we get to a staple of his character, doing eeny meeny miny mo to decide who he kills. That just adds more insult to injury and making for an unbelievably tense final shot. This introduction to Negan in season 6 is almost perfect. One of the best scenes I've ever seen on television. It perfectly introduces Negan as someone that should not be messed with at all costs, and introduces his character as a terrifying sociopath with an incredibly fun sense of humor. This scene is a masterclass of filmmaking. Bringing the show's most beloved characters and having one unknown be killed is awesome, and it's a perfect example of how to introduce a villain. And the fact that the season ends with us not knowing who he killed sets us up perfectly for season 7. We still don't know whom he killed until we see the scene from a different angle, and we finally know who he kills. Abraham. And my initial reaction was, okay, do it? I wasn't a huge fan of Abraham. I mean, I liked him, but he's no Glenn, so as long as he doesn't kill Glenn, I'm fine. Yeah, Negan kills Glenn. And you would think that this would be the tipping point, that this moment makes me hate Negan, but I actually love it. I don't love Glenn leaving the show, but if he was gonna kill anyone and make an impact on me, Glenn was the right choice, and holy crap does this decision have some repercussions in the future. After this scene, Negan continues to be the boss that he is. He strolls through Alexandria like he owns the place, because he does, continuing to make some hilarious jokes and statements.
Little pig, let me in. This is the kind of thing that just tickles my balls. Is that you, Rick, underneath all that man bush?
And I can't be the only one to notice that you got a fat lady in charge of keeping track of rations, can I?
Holy crap! You are creepy as shit, sneaking up on me wearing that collar with that freaky ass smile. Ha ha ha! Easy peasy lemon squeezy.
His whole demeanor during this scene is perfect. He's able to make everyone at Alexandria a baby compared to him, doing everything he says. And even while doing that, he's hilarious and he keeps the mood up. And later we learn more about Negan and the Saviors when Carl attacks them. Carl is literally holding Negan at gunpoint, and Negan continues to be cocky and crack some jokes. Negan takes him captive and shows him around. Throughout this whole exchange, we learn things about Negan. That he's not really a terrible person. I mean, he's not the nicest, but he's just like a boss to his people, similar to how Rick is a boss of Alexandria. This interaction with Carl is actually really important to Negan's character, as it shows he has a deep respect for Carl, and their interaction is really interesting and cool to see. Later on in the season, we actually see some of Negan's leadership, and one part of that is punishment. Negan famously sees people as resources, so he doesn't just kill for no reason. So when he does kill people, you know it's for a reason. One prominent example is when this guy tried to do something non-consensual to Sasha, and Negan breaks it up, stating that that's against the rules, and he kills him. What a gentleman. This is another interesting thing about Negan, and it's that he actually gives off a pretty nice guy persona. He's obviously doing some crappy things, but it actually seems like the people in power below him are doing the really bad things, while he's just the guy in charge. Think when Simon killed the people at the garbage place. Negan didn't sanction that, and didn't take that lying down. He's a decent guy who just has some kind of bad people around him. Throughout season 7, Rick tries to formulate a plan to kill Negan, and luckily for us, he doesn't succeed, and we move on to season 8. Rick's group manages to herd a bunch of walkers around Negan's base, and Negan and Gabriel actually get trapped in a trailer together, and they have a chat. We actually learn a lot about Negan here. He explains that he used to help kids, which in the future we learn that that means he was a gym teacher, and most importantly, he had a wife named Lucille who died from cancer during the apocalypse. It may not be much, but this whole scene solidified more of the character of Negan. He has a backstory just like every character in Alexandria and Hilltop. He's just like Rick, Daryl, or Glenn. He's more complex than just the guy who killed Glenn. And this is what sets him apart from other villains like the Governor or the future Alpha. He has depth. He's not just evil to be evil. He's interesting. He's a detailed, flawed character who, even with all this information, continues to be a funny a-hole throughout it all. And that's not something I can say about pretty much every character in the show. They're almost always somber and brooding. Someone needed to bring some halfway decent comedy to the show, and that's what Negan brings that no one else does. Honestly, for a majority of season 7 and 8, not much happens with Negan. He has a hell of an introduction, but the way the show tells its story really suffers in fleshing out characters. Also, the show suffers from poor directing, storytelling, and all around these seasons are honestly not really good, but Negan continues to be the best part of the show at this point. His attitudes and dialogues towards other characters are so well put together that it makes these lackluster seasons worth watching just to hear his hilarious dialogue. Also, in season 9, spoiler alert, Carl frickin' dies. It kinda comes out of nowhere and isn't handled all that well, but why I'm bringing it up is because, like I said, Negan had a lot of respect for Carl and liked him a lot. And most important, Carl wrote a letter addressed to Negan, telling him and Rick to stop the violence between them. Rick stating that it's too late, but Negan stating that Rick should just give up this rebellion. Eventually, Rick and Negan spend some time together, and it goes about as good as you would expect. Negan actually changes his offer from taking 50% of Rick's stuff to 25%. That's honestly really generous, and we know he means it, because after all,
But I'm a man of my word.
he also expresses his frustrations with Rick, and honestly, with everything he's causing, it's understandable why Negan would be mad. Also, Rick burns Lucille during this point, and Negan gets real mad. And at first glance, this anger he expresses might come off as funny or even egotistical, but after learning that Lucille was his wife's name, this bat might be the last thing of his wife that he has, adding a hint of tragedy to Negan's character, and honestly, a really good use of storytelling and acting. This is later confirmed when he's taken captive by Jadis. The main climax of the show's 8th season is the final stand against Negan, where Rick comes out on top. The final standoff with him and Rick is pretty cool, but its ending is honestly kinda stupid. So Rick slashes Negan's throat, and I was like, oh crap, that's the end of Negan, I guess. But then...
Save him.
Huh? His jugular just got cut, and some ragtag doctor is gonna save him in the apocalypse? Sorry, I call BS. But hey, I was celebrating because one of my favorite characters gets to survive. So whatever, I'll suspend my disbelief. Now we enter the prisoner Negan phase, my least favorite phase, and that's because he does practically nothing. The show for a decent chunk just forgets that Negan exists and sidelights him while he's stuck in this little cage. It's honestly really dumb. We go from a season where Negan is the big top dog to where Negan is stuck in a cell. There are some important moments for his character though. He seems to have this delusional episode where he loses his touch with himself and just breaks down in front of Maggie. He kind of lets himself go during this time, growing his hair out and just overall not doing well. Maggie goes to kill him where she just doesn't because he's gone so far gone at this point. Now there's a point in the show around this time where Rick, the main character of the show up till this point, actually leaves the show. Once again, it comes out of nowhere, and I was just shocked by it. But then the question became, who do we follow now? Michonne? Daryl? Carol? The hundreds of underdeveloped, unimpressive side characters that we keep trying to make important? Well, at this point, the main character is pretty much whomever you want it to be. Can you guess who it was for me? That's right, Negan, baby. The show gets a time jump, and Negan transforms himself. He's no longer the brooding cellmate. He's funny and witty again. He's more wise and calm than he was before. He begins to develop a friendship with Judith, and their interactions are pretty heartwarming to see. I feel like this is the character growth I would have liked to see expressed through the show, as opposed to a time jump. Granted, it would probably be really boring. He is in a cell after all. But overall, this change in character is for the best, because we don't have to deal with crybaby Negan anymore. This is also the time where we're introduced to the Whisperers, and more importantly, Alpha, who is my actual least favorite character of anything ever. I'm not exaggerating when I say I hated her so much and wanted her character to die in every scene she was in. I actually considered making this video on Alpha and why I think she sucks so much ass, but I thought, you know what? I should focus on the positives. But now that I'm reminded of her existence, maybe, just maybe I'll take a crack at her. There is a reason why I'm bringing up my hatred for her, and that'll be explained in a bit. But for now, let's just focus on Negan. He actually escapes the prison to explore the world, going back to the sanctuary, killing a few walkers, and eventually he deems this world not desirable and returns to Alexandria. Why he does this is beyond me. I guess he just missed the sense of community as he immediately went to the sanctuary when he was let out. But whatever, more prisoner Negan, I guess. Eventually he's brought with a group outside the walls when a big snowstorm hits. Here he continues to crack some hilarious jokes, make some good points, and we see his relationship with Judith grow as he runs into the snow to rescue her. This is another thing I love about Negan, is the way he treats kids. When he was a villain, he would never kill kids, something even the innocent Carol has done, and also the show often pairs him with kids. This is explained later by telling us he was a high school gym coach, and so he has a natural connection with children and wants to help them grow into successful adults. It's a really interesting dynamic to have this ex-ruthless killer be a kind father figure to so many on the show. Just some really interesting stuff. Following this topic of Negan and kids is when he protects Lydia. So this character named Lydia is attacked and beaten up pretty badly, but Negan swoops in and saves them. But by doing this, he unknowingly kills one of these asshats, and in an unbelievably annoying fashion, everyone turns on Negan and wants to kill him. Luckily for us, Negan gets let out by an unknown person, and I wonder who let him out. It gets interesting when he's out and meets someone who is a son of a person who used to be a savior. He tries to egg on Negan. Is that the phrase? What does it mean to egg someone? Oh, it is the word. Okay, I'm right. Okay, back to the script. He tries to egg on Negan to go back to his old persona, but Negan never really gives in, even when he's offered a Lucille replacement. They meet a family who, by the end of the episode, gets killed by the guy who was with Negan, and Negan kills him as a sort of revenge. This fit of rage was sparked in Negan for a few things. Obviously, he's less okay with killing now, and also this guy killed a kid, and obviously Negan hates that. It's an interesting show of how Negan has changed compared to people like this. Then we get Negan's interaction with the Whisperers. Now, I don't love how this plays out, but I love how it ends. Let's talk about it. So Negan gets inducted into the Whisperers through a bunch of trials, and through all of this he continues to be hilarious. One notable line that made me full-on belt out laughter is,
"You will serve us better as one of the dead." Ready for my goddamn skin suit.
Now this whole scenario is framed really interesting, where you never really know why Negan is there. You know it's not because he wants to be there, because he doesn't seem to like the ideologies and philosophies of the group, and also he gives off a vibe like he has some greater master plan. We finally see what Negan's goal was in episode 12. Negan kidnaps Lydia, already a red flag, cause why? Then he tells Alpha that he has her. Red flag number 2, what are you doing, bro? Then he leads Alpha to a cabin where he gets behind her holding something. Wait, is he gonna? Yes! Finally! Get out of here, let's go! So yeah, Negan kills Alpha, and when I tell you this final scene got me so hyped, this is where we finally get to see what Negan has been planning. I don't know why it took him so long, but hey, better late than never, right? Now, as I was watching, I was hoping he was gonna kill Alpha because, you know, I hate her, but I never expected it to be this epic. Now, later on in the show, Negan is given the chance to become the new Alpha, but he still chooses the people of Alexandria over them. Then we get to a main part of Negan's development, him meeting Maggie. Now, understandably, Maggie is pretty pissed at Negan for killing Glenn. I mean, it's pretty understandable. Season 10 doesn't really go into their dynamic. It's something season 11 dives into pretty well. But before that, we have to get to episode 22, an episode entirely based around Negan and his backstory. Now, during this time in season 11, a lot of the episodes have just been focuses on different characters. And to be honest, it's not really all that fun to watch. Don't get me wrong, there's still decently done episodes, but there's no common storyline, it's not really entertaining. That's why it's all the more shocking when Negan's episode is one of the best in the show. We learn so much about him in just one episode, and we really get to see how much he's grown as a character. First things first in this episode, Negan is let go by Carol, and he goes to find Lucille again, which he does. Then we get a flashback, and here's where it gets interesting. Negan at the start of the apocalypse was a wimp. He didn't want to kill a walker, he's a kind guy, and most of all, he doesn't have that cocky, funny personality we would later get. We also see his life before the fall, where he's not the greatest husband. He gets fired from his job at a school and plays video games all day. And his relationship with his wife shows his change when the apocalypse happens. He goes from a caring but selfish husband to a ride-or-die savior in the apocalypse for his wife. Their relationship is incredibly realistic, and their interaction is just really sweet. He tracks down chemo packets to help fight off her cancer. He does whatever he can to try and keep his wife safe. And yet, towards the end of the episode, Lucille dies, and this moment transforms him. He burns the house down and exits it in one of the most badass ways possible, and he makes his iconic bat, later known as Lucille. This shows who Negan really is. He's an incredibly caring person, but when Lucille died, he had to become something else. He had to change to be more eccentric, more dangerous, and that's how we get from this to this. This episode is an incredible use of character development, and I would call it one of my favorites. But nonetheless, this episode is where Negan goes from a pretty deep, hilarious character to an incredibly tragic tale of a caring husband turned violent serial killer. It's just incredible, and it was this episode that solidified Negan as my favorite character. Because up until this point, Glenn was still my favorite. Yes, I loved Negan, but Glenn was the character who you rooted for 6 seasons long. Up until this point, Negan was the character I enjoyed watching the most, but he wasn't the deepest character. But this episode changed that, and I'm so glad it did. Season 11 starts off kind of rocky for Negan. He's brought on this mission to find food or something for Alexandria, and Negan keeps telling them to turn back, but everyone just hates him so they don't listen to him. And wow, shocker, Negan was right. A lot of people die, and it's just a whole mess. Negan is given a chance to save Maggie as she's dangling off the edge, but in an incredibly understandable move, he doesn't. I say this is understandable because it's pretty obvious that Maggie wants to kill him, and he even says that the only reason she brought him is to get him directly or indirectly killed. So letting her die is pretty reasonable, but because the show starts to severely decline, Maggie's fine, because we can't kill off the one of 3 good characters left in this show. Then Maggie lets another person die, even though she could have saved him, and we're supposed to root for her on this one? What a hypocrite. She literally just did the same thing that Negan just did, but it's okay because why? Whatever, I'm getting off topic. For the majority of the season, Negan and Maggie have this will they won't they relationship, and by that I mean, will one of them kill the other or not? Eventually, Negan and Maggie are separated from the rest of the group, and we get some character development from both of them. Maggie is so driven by the concept of getting more food, while Negan has more of a desire to just go back and cut their losses short. Honestly, throughout these whole interactions, Negan is just so tired out and wants to go home, while everyone else is so stubborn to stay and find food, and it's just pretty entertaining. Negan at this point isn't so much the jokester he was in his villain days, he's more the voice of reason that everyone else just ignores. So while it is slightly less entertaining, it's more important to have a character with so much self-preservation and honesty. When he's stressed or in situations where he's fighting, he tends to lean more on the funny side and egg on the people he's against, and he's still incredibly funny when he wants to be. Even through all this, he still stays to aid Maggie in her quest, and they end up destroying another settlement together. Cool. There is a pretty incredible moment between him and Maggie when they actually take down the settlement owned by this dude, where Maggie is trying to decide whether or not to kill the survivors, and she asks Negan what he thinks, and he says,
You know what I think.
like, it's just all so cool and fits both of their characters so well. And by the end, she takes Negan's advice and kills them. This is kinda where Maggie starts to trust Negan a little. After all, he's not the bat-wielding psycho anymore. He's the old wise guy of the group. But after all this, Negan leaves them anyway to be on his own. I was worried this would be the last we'd see of him. After all, this is a decent send-off, but luckily, there's a bit more Negan to be had this season. Once the rest of the group starts to fight back against the Commonwealth, Negan shows up and helps them, but he's not alone. He's got a wife and a kid on the way. He also gets to talk to Maggie's kid, Herschel. Yeah, Maggie was pregnant with Glenn's kid before he died. It's a whole thing. And Herschel learns that Negan killed Glenn, and honestly, it's just a really good scene, and we get to see Negan's development. He describes himself as having been a bad man, but not anymore. We also see the regret that he has for killing Glenn, and it all seems to come together really well to build up his character even more. And later on, Maggie leaves to do some mission, and she leaves Herschel with Negan and explains that she trusts him more now. The writers must have known how good of a dynamic Negan and Maggie have, because they put them together for a lot of this and future seasons. Both of them play off each other really well, and it's really interesting to see. Because obviously Maggie shouldn't trust Negan, but they work well and kick ass together so much that it makes for such a fun interaction. Negan throughout the season is kind of hired by the Alexandria people to help take down Commonwealth, and it's really fun to see. I especially like this exchange between him and Jerry, where Jerry just walks up to him like they're best buds. Jerry's such a wholesome and chill dude, and his friendship-like behavior towards Negan is so refreshing. Eventually, Negan gets captured by the Commonwealth, and while I didn't like his prisoner era, I really like him in this prison camp because it really shows his development. He's obviously really focused on escaping and saving himself, but he's more extremely concerned for his wife, who was also captured. So much so that when they're held at gunpoint, he pleads to let his wife go, and his original plan was to die to save her. This Negan, the guy who is so hell-bent on control, order, and self-preservation, is willing to lay down his life in a slight chance that his wife will be able to escape. It's an unbelievable showing of his character growth, and it's awesome to see this change, but luckily he's saved and is able to escape and help take down the Commonwealth. Also, during the end of the season, the walkers start to change a little. Some gain the ability to climb walls, which is a really cool concept. I'm glad they waited till the final episodes to do something interesting with these stupid zombies. Anyway, I mention this because it leads to an amazing line and delivery from Negan in response to the changes.
What the fuck?
Like, bro, it's such a simple line, but it's delivered so amazingly, it just made me burst out laughing. In the final episode of the series, he actually gets to share an incredibly heartfelt moment with Maggie, where he expresses how he now knows what Maggie felt like when Glenn died, because he experienced that with his wife in the camp. And again, how did this happen? We go from this cocky, hilarious guy to a person with an extreme desire to keep his wife safe at all costs. Someone who did bad things with very little remorse, to someone with extreme guilt over his past actions. It's incredible. And that's basically the end of Negan's character. He is in the spin-off Dead City, which I watched, and it's fine, I guess. He just remains the same character. Basically, he's wise, helpful, respectful, but he does have a few moments where he releases villain Negan, like when he kills this guy over the balcony.
Knock, knock.
It's fun to watch for sure. Negan is still as charming and entertaining as ever, but I mean, the show doesn't develop him a lot, at least nowhere near the scale of The Walking Dead. So now, I kind of talked about everything, but I'll summarize my whole thoughts about Negan Smith and his development throughout the show. First off, as a villain, he's incredibly entertaining. He's my favorite villain from the show, but that's not saying much given the competition. But nonetheless, he's one of my favorite villains on television. He's both the comic relief and the most terrifying badass in the whole show. He's able to make Rick, the hardened ex-cop killer, look like a complete wuss by comparison. The scenes where he walks into Alexandria and just chills are still some of my favorite scenes in the whole show. His complete cocky attitude and complete boss nature makes for both an incredibly formidable foe and the character I'm most looking forward to seeing while watching. Now, the show during his villain era as a whole kinda sucks. The directing is bad, the way the show is staged is really weird, where one episode focuses on one character and the next focuses on a completely different character is really terrible. It makes for an unnatural viewing experience. The camera quality is terrible and grainy, and I get the show is a little old, but like season 7 was 2016, come on. The writing is pretty bad. The whole show was just kind of dipping in terms of quality. This is also the time where the show started to panic, I think, because it was getting a little boring. So they just kept adding characters to be like, see, we're still interesting, look at all these new characters, and barely any of them stick. I'm saying all this to show the state of the show when Negan entered the picture. It needed a savior to bring my interest in the show back, and Negan was that bright light in a dark, dying show. If he wasn't as good as he was, I probably would have stopped watching the show after Glenn died, because Glenn was my favorite character at that point. So once he died, I was like, I guess there's Rick. But once Negan started to be more of a figure, and I started to like him more and more, he replaced Glenn for me on the rankings. I'm sorry, Glenn, I still love you. I think if the show was filmed better and had a better storytelling technique, villain Negan would probably be even higher for me. All this to say, he's a staple of television villains, and his takedown is really interesting to me because part of me was rooting for Rick, he's the main character after all, but also a part of me was rooting for Negan. His interactions with Carl really built him up as a person who could be a colleague or even a friend to Rick. Honestly, everything Negan says during this season about Rick is true. He is an asshole. He did indirectly get Carl killed. He should comply with Negan's rules. If you think about it, 50% isn't even all that bad, and the fact that Negan changes it to 25% is pretty crazy. If anything, the rest of the saviors are kind of the villains of the season. A lot of them are gross, mean people, most of whom don't follow Negan's rules and get punished for it. Negan also was a fresh take on the Walking Dead villain. Now, I'm not a fan of the Walking Dead formula, as I call it, where they go from one villain to the next, to the next, to the next. It gets boring when it's just the same thing over and over, but Negan was new. He was a bad guy, but he was entertaining this time. He was giddy. His dialogue was geniusly written and led to an incredibly fun character who outlasted even Rick himself. Once Negan is defeated though, and we get to Prisoner Negan, he's nowhere as entertaining, partly because he can't do much in a prison cell, but his changes are still incredibly interesting to watch. He goes from a loud and obnoxious villain to a quiet, wise listener. He's still incredibly fun to watch, he has some comedic moments, but he's more the old grandpa of the group than the comic relief anymore. Once he's released, he gets to re-enter that entertaining personality when he's with the Whisperers. While he's with my least favorite group of the show, he makes jokes, suggests good plans, gets to use Budget Lucille again, and it's fun, it's engaging again. Him working with Carol and Daryl is such a fun change from the hate they had for each other in the seasons prior. Also, his demeanor while he's free continues to be interesting. While maybe not being as fun or goofy as before, he's still wise and fun to watch. And that's what's so interesting about Negan to me, and that's that the writers were able to change Negan from a funny villain to a wise father figure. It's fascinating, and I can't believe they were able to pull it off. I also wanted to briefly talk about the acting choice for Negan. In the comics, he's this big, formidable Kingpin from Spider-Verse looking guy, but in the real world, there aren't many actors who fit that description. So they went for a more skinny, rugged look, and it fits the character perfectly. Jeffrey Dean Morgan slides into the role unbelievably realistic. It's really funny to go from this scene to an interview with him. Like, he talks the same, but he's not threatening. His whole demeanor that Morgan puts on for him really works well to serve up this amazing character. Even when he's not the villain, Morgan is able to play the wise grandpa figure really spectacularly, and I can't imagine a different actor playing this role. So to wrap everything up, Negan starts from an unbelievably fun antagonist to pretty much the main character of the show. We see him change naturally over time, and we see the characters around him start to trust him more as time goes on. His dialogue is either incredibly insightful and important to hear, or some of the funniest things I've ever heard. His character arc is believable, interesting to watch, and see take effect. He's acted amazingly to the point where I can't see anyone else doing a better job at playing him. He kills my least favorite character in the show. He's amazing, and that's why Negan Smith is the best character in The Walking Dead.